Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we have entered day 97 of the ongoing war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And before I start, I please want to try and elaborate. In my coverage of this ongoing war, I am trying very hard to be as unbiased as possible, and I am simply giving you, the listener and viewer, the facts that are occurring on the ground, and at the same time, I'm trying to provide a bit of analysis in kind of where the conflict is and where it could be heading. And if it's not what either side wants to hear, obviously there is a tremendous amount of propaganda in the ongoing conflict. And any news that would considered to be bad news or negative news against either side's war effort has the tendency to be construed as a bias. And that, again, that's not the case. It is simply my analytical view and MFAN's analytical view on what is occurring in this conflict. Now, obviously, the fighting continues. And right now, the Russian war strategy and war goal right now appears to be to put so much pressure on the Ukrainian military that eventually we reach a point where we could see the wide-scale collapse of Ukrainian defensive operations and the ability of the Ukrainian military to operate cohesively against the Russian military. So we're not seeing a tremendous amount of maneuvering from Russia, but we continue to see a pressure campaign that is designed to pound Ukrainian forces quite literally into oblivion. They are using heavy amounts of artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, and tactical aircraft to engage and destroy Ukrainian frontline combat units, while at the same time focusing on destroying the ability of the state of Ukraine to proficiently fight a war. And that includes, but not limited to, obviously targeting supply depots, military factories, rear area operations, and then obviously also to even a greater extent, those forward deployed units with a lot of heavy artillery. And the Russian strategy right now appears to be to continue to apply this pressure until you have a general collapse of the front lines and rear echelon as well of the Ukrainian military. So the Russians then hope that a large-scale maneuver blitz would then see the capture of large amounts of territory. And obviously the Ukrainians are trying to counter that with layers of defensive lines. Obviously, there are defensive lines stretching from Severodonetsk, if we look here in the far east, and then Lysychansk, and then further layers of defensive lines going all the way to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. And they are trying to fight this deep defensive methodology, but at the same time, they are also, meaning they, the Ukrainians, are also using this, what I perceive as a not one step back philosophy. And the reason I believe the Ukrainians have instituted that strategy in giving up no territory, no towns, no villages, and fighting for each and every locale, one, obviously, it tends to be a drain on certain aspects of Russian morale to some extent. But also, the Ukrainians are very aware that if they lose territory, if they lose, for instance, Severodonetsk, if they lose Lysychansk, if they lose Bakhmut, they will not regain those areas. The likelihood that Ukraine will regain territory lost in this conflict right now is rather remote in terms of the Russian goal and war strategy, and even post-war strategy and war aims. I think at this point, the Ukrainians are very much aware that whatever they lose, they are probably not getting back. And the Ukrainians at this point simply do not want to lose any more territory. So that is why we are seeing this not one step back philosophy on the part of Ukrainian forces. One, it does have some morale issues with Russian forces, but to a greater extent, the Ukrainians simply do not want to lose any more territory to the Russian Federation. Now, with that being said, the Russians continue to push, advance, and bombard Ukrainian forces all along the front line, especially in this area that we're looking at, running the length of the far eastern Donbass area of operations, running obviously from Popasna all the way around to Izum in the northwest quadrant of the map that you can clearly see here. But that is kind of what we're seeing on the ground now. I would say that there is definitely concerns within the Ukrainian quadrant. Reference a couple of different issues. One is this continued pressure campaign, and I think the Ukrainian state is doing a very good job in terms of messaging its propaganda and the concept in the West that the Ukrainians continue to hold the Russians back and continue to win this conflict. But the problem with that is not completely accurate. Right now, in all probability, unfortunately for the Ukrainian military at this point, they're now taking more daily casualties than the Russian military. We don't know what that number is, but we estimate probably the low number is anywhere from 50 to 100 KIA per day. Now, that could be much higher depending on what happens in a given day, depending on air attacks, depending on success of certain maneuver elements, and obviously the real killer, which is artillery. And if you've ever been under a sustained artillery bombardment, it absolutely saps your soul. It is very, very disconcerting to be pummeled day in and day out by these heavy artillery systems that the Russians possess. Yes, the Ukrainians are also firing back with its own artillery systems, but the Russians have more and are able to sustain that artillery bombardments or those artillery bombardments much longer and at a much higher rate of fire than the Ukrainian military is. Another issue for the Ukrainians at this point is a supply. I had talked about in a previous episode where, yes, the Russians use Russian equipment or pre-Soviet and obviously post-Soviet equipment, as do the Ukrainian military, and especially in terms of heavy artillery. And I talked about that the fact that that being a negative for Ukrainian forces in terms of being able to continue to supply munitions for those heavy artillery, especially 122, 152 millimeter systems. And the problem with that is a lot of that is actually manufactured or was manufactured in Ukraine. And unfortunately, a lot of those factories have been destroyed or targeted, and a lot of those supply depots for those 122 millimeter and 152 millimeter systems that the Ukrainians use have been targeted by Russian forces. And the Ukrainians don't really have the ability to target those same that same infrastructure in terms of ammunition and munition production inside of the Russian Federation. At the same time, it's very difficult for Western nations to then supply that ammunition and munitions for those heavy artillery pieces because the West simply does not produce those systems. So therein lies the trick bag with the Ukrainian military. It has a lot of these Russian systems or pre-Soviet systems, Soviet systems, but they're running out of ammunition for them, and the West can't supply in significant amounts that sort of ammunition. Obviously, they can go into maybe some of the eastern bloc states of the European Union, i.e. The Czech or Slovak republics, maybe Romania and some other nation states, Poland, and then produce or take existing stocks that have been stored and then deliver those to the Ukrainians. But that, again, is still a finite resource that eventually is going to start running out, and we're starting to see that. And then with the Western delivery of equipment, that is becoming more and more precarious because the Russians see it as an escalation. And right now, it would appear that the Biden administration, the U.S. White House, is very reluctant to provide those HIMARS or those multiple launch rocket systems that could be handed over to the Ukrainians in numbers that would really matter. And those would be numbers probably in the neighborhood of 100 systems. And then obviously the actual rockets themselves. And the issue with the HIMARS, it has, basically think of it as three different types of rockets that the HIMARS can fire. One is a more of a smaller caliber unguided rocket. Then they do have more of the smaller caliber guided rockets, and then they have the larger, what they call the ATACMS, which is more of a short range, very precise ballistic missile, and a HIMARS will fire one of those as opposed to 6 of these free flight or these guided rockets, these GPS guided rockets that they can also fire. Now, they have not been produced in the numbers that would probably help the Ukrainian military. It's a relatively newer system, especially the HIMARS, and then obviously the guided systems as well. The ATACMS, the larger rocket, there are not limitless stores of those in the United States and some of these European states. There's just not a lot. I mean, there's enough for the United States to use in case of war, but it just hasn't produced in the amounts where we could just send them a plethora of these systems to the Ukrainians. And now that also brings up one other major issue too, is that larger ATACMS system, the ballistic missile system, that can also be fired out of the HIMARS or the MLRS system. That it has a very long range, so it could strike very deep into the Russian Federation, meaning hundreds of kilometers. And again, that could cause some sort of escalation, whereas the smaller rockets obviously have a much less extended range in terms of what that capability is. But that's kind of the situation right now with behind these HIMARS or these rockets that the Ukrainians are begging to get their hands on. And would it change the outcome of the conflict? Would it change the course of the conflict? Possibly. I would say that it would definitely escalate the conflict. If the Ukrainians possessed the ATACMS, and that gave the Ukrainians the ability to strike targets deep inside of Russia with a very high grade of precision, then obviously that could cause some issues for the Russians, and it would also continue to escalate the conflict. Again, I talked about before, I don't think this conflict is finished escalating, and we are continuing on that trajectory towards continued escalation, where we could see direct conflict between Russia and the West, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or elements of NATO, or the United States as this conflict continues. But to kind of end things off today, the Russians continue with its again what I would define as this pressure campaign designed to eventually get the Ukrainian military to a tipping point where you could see a general collapse of the front line. And what would happen then is you would very rapidly see a Russian large-scale maneuver operation, not the pressure campaign that we're seeing now, but actually large-scale maneuver forces seizing control of large swaths of territory of eastern Ukraine. And right now, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, that pressure is continuing to build and build. And the question right now is, when do we hit that tipping point where we do see that generalized collapse of the Russian forces? Right now, the Ukrainians would actually prefer to see the Russians start to maneuver more like they were seeing in the early stages of the conflict, where they can inflict more casualties upon Russian forces. And that's just, therein lies the problem. The Russians are not doing that, and thus are not allowing the Ukrainians to inflict the kind of casualties that they had inflicted on the Russian forces in the early stages of the conflict. And that is what is really hurting the Ukrainian military right now. It's not seeing those same sorts of success that it was seeing early in the campaign in terms of inflicting those high rate of casualties against Russian forces. Now, obviously, there are one-offs, and we still are seeing Russian forces take casualties. But at the same time, right now, we've kind of reached that tipping point where we're starting to see the Ukrainians attempt to launch counteroffensive, smaller battalion and maybe brigade-sized element counteroffensive. I mean, no more than 3 to 4 battalion groupings in these offensive operations by the Ukrainians. But the Ukrainians as well are starting to suffer serious casualties when they launch these offensive operations against Russian forces. Now, we have received reports that the latest offensive operation by the Ukrainians that took place to the southwest of Zaporizhia. That is not on my map here, but that offensive really hurt some Ukrainian capability in that area, as they did take some fairly reported heavy casualties in that limited offensive operation. But that's kind of what's happening right now. It is positional in terms of localized maneuver operations, but the real issue right now for the Ukrainians and the Russian strategy, again, is this pressure campaign that the Russian military is utilizing. So we'll continue to monitor the situation, obviously watching what's happening in Severodonetsk. It looks like that city right here where my cursor is circling is about ready to fall to Russian forces. The Russians are actually in the city and are continuing to clear the city of Ukrainian infantry, and the Ukrainian forces continue to fight in that city. Now the question is, are the Ukrainians eventually going to fall back to their next line, which is this, along the Donets River, just to the southwest of Severodonetsk, and then look at defending Lysychansk. That is the next fallback point for Ukrainian forces. So again, thanks for joining us today. More information very, very soon. And again, I much appreciate everyone commenting and providing insight. And I truly appreciate everyone watching our videos. Have a good day.